Imagine moving into your dream home, a stunning $3 million estate in the affluent suburbs of Chicago. You are finally feeling like your life is perfectly on track after a year of profound personal heartbreak. That was me exactly 3 days after unpacking my final box. I was standing in the sunlit kitchen when my phone rang with an unknown number. It was the previous owner, a retired federal investigator named Beatrice, and her voice was dead serious. She told me she had forgotten to disconnect a hidden security camera in the study. She said she had just watched my husband and his mother pry up the hardwood floor, hide a bag of unidentified white powder in a secret safe, and discuss exactly which corrupt doctor they were going to pay to have me permanently committed to a psychiatric ward. She told me not to go home to not tell my husband, and to meet her alone immediately. The phone nearly slipped from my sweating hands as the reality of her words crashed over me. My name is Kelsey. I am 33 years old, and what my husband Preston did not know was that the fragile, easily manipulated wife he thought he was drugging was actually a high-end art restorer and the secret owner of a $15 million private auction house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who severely underestimated your intelligence. I left the house immediately and drove straight to the address Beatrice gave me. It was a quiet, dimly lit diner on the edge of town, far away from the manicured lawns of our neighborhood. Beatrice was sitting in a corner booth, her laptop already open on the Formica table. She did not offer any polite pleasantries. She just turned the screen toward me, tapped the spacebar, and told me to watch closely. The hidden camera footage was crystal clear. It showed Preston, the man I had loved and married 5 years ago, kneeling in my new library alongside his mother Sylvia. Sylvia was a woman whose entire personality revolved around her fading old money status and her deep-seated belief that I was utterly beneath her family. In the video, she was holding a small vial of white powder. I heard her voice hiss through the laptop speakers, complaining that I was still too coherent and that they needed to drastically increase the dosage. She told Preston that without a formal medical certificate proving I had severe schizophrenia, they could never gain control of my lucrative art business. Preston just laughed. It was a cold, calculating, and cruel sound that I had never heard from him before. He assured his mother that he would call the police next week to have me involuntarily committed. He casually mentioned that everyone in our social circle already believed I was losing my mind, a narrative he had been carefully planting ever since my devastating miscarriage last year. He was weaponizing my deepest grief to steal my life. My blood ran ice cold, but the initial shock quickly morphed into a terrifying razor-sharp clarity. I was an art restorer. My entire career was built on spotting fakes, uncovering hidden layers, and meticulously repairing damage. I thanked Beatrice, memorized the exact location of the hidden floorboard safe from the video, and drove back to the house we had supposedly bought to start our fresh new life together. I pulled into the driveway, taking 2 deep breaths and forcing my hands to stop shaking before I turned the key in the front door. I had to play the role of the erratic, emotional wife perfectly. Preston was standing in the grand foyer waiting for me. He looked like the absolute picture of a devoted, loving husband. He wore a soft cashmere sweater, offering me his perfect practice smile that I now knew was a complete mask. In one hand, he held a crystal glass of expensive red wine. In the other, he held 2 small capsules that he always insisted were my daily fertility vitamins. He walked toward me, his voice dripping with fake concern, asking how my afternoon errand was and insisting I take my vitamins right away to help manage my stress levels. Every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run out the door, but I knew I had to play his game until I held all the winning cards. I reached for the wine glass, intentionally making sure my fingers trembled, just enough to look clumsy and uncoordinated. As he handed the glass to me, I deliberately knocked the rim hard against his wrist. The dark red liquid splashed all over his expensive sweater and shattered across the pristine hardwood floor, looking almost like blood. Preston let out a sharp, aggressive breath. His charming mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the monster underneath before he quickly caught himself and forced his smile back into place. I immediately started apologizing profusely, letting my voice pitch up in manufactured panic. I babbled frantically about being so clumsy and needing to get towels. Before he could stop me or force the pills into my hand, I bolted straight up the stairs and into the master bathroom, locking the heavy oak door firmly behind me. I turned the sink faucet on full blast to drown out any noise. Leaning against the cold marble counter, staring at my pale reflection, the terrifying reality set in. I was trapped in a house completely rigged by my enemies, married to a man actively trying to destroy my mind. But Preston had made one massive fatal miscalculation. He thought I was completely isolated. Reaching into the hidden lining of my leather tote bag, I pulled out a secure secondary phone I use solely for private art acquisitions. I quickly opened a new text message. I needed an ally, someone smart, ruthless, and entirely outside of Sylvia's sphere of influence. I typed the number for Terrence. Terrence was my brother-in-law married to Preston's sister. More importantly, he was a brilliant corporate attorney and an African-American man whom Sylvia absolutely despised. Her blatant racial prejudice and old money elitism meant she treated Terrence with constant, barely concealed disrespect. I knew Terrence saw right through the family's fake perfection. I typed my message with flying fingers. I need you at my house right now. Bring a professional bug sweeper. Do not tell your wife, and absolutely do not tell Preston. I hit send, gripping the edge of the sink as I waited for the battle to begin. Imagine standing in the sunlit kitchen of your brand new $3 million home, finally feeling like your life is coming together, only to receive a phone call that shatters your entire reality. That was me, exactly 3 days after unpacking my final box in the Chicago suburbs. The caller was the previous owner, a retired federal investigator named Beatrice. Her voice was dead serious as she told me she had forgotten to disconnect a hidden security camera in the study. She said she had just watched my husband and his mother pry up the hardwood floor, hide a bag of unidentified white powder in a secret safe, and discuss exactly which corrupt doctor they were going to pay to have me permanently committed to a psychiatric ward. She told me not to go home, to not tell my husband, and to meet her alone immediately. The phone nearly slipped from my sweating hands as the sheer terror of her words crashed over me. My name is Kelsey. I am 33 years old, and what my husband Preston did not know was that the fragile, easily manipulated wife he thought he was drugging was actually a high-end art restorer and the secret owner of a $15 million private auction house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who severely underestimated your intelligence. I left the house immediately and drove straight to the address Beatrice gave me. It was a quiet, dimly lit diner on the edge of town, far away from the manicured lawns of our neighborhood. Beatrice was sitting in a corner booth, her laptop already open on the Formica table. She did not offer any polite pleasantries. She just turned the screen toward me, tapped the spacebar, and told me to watch closely. The hidden camera footage was crystal clear. It showed Preston, the man I had loved and married 5 years ago, kneeling in my new library alongside his mother, Sylvia. Sylvia was a woman whose entire personality revolved around her fading old money status and her deep-seated belief that I was utterly beneath her family. In the video, she was holding a small vial of white powder. I heard her voice hiss through the laptop speakers, complaining that I was still too coherent and that they needed to drastically increase the dosage. She told Preston that without a formal medical certificate proving I had severe schizophrenia, they could never gain control of my lucrative art business. Preston just laughed. It was a cold, calculating, and cruel sound that I had never heard from him before. He assured his mother that he would call the police next week to have me involuntarily committed. He casually mentioned that everyone in our social circle already believed I was losing my mind, a narrative he had been carefully planting ever since my devastating miscarriage last year. He was weaponizing my deepest grief to steal my life. My blood ran ice cold, but the initial shock quickly morphed into a terrifying razor-sharp clarity. I was an art restorer. My entire career was built on spotting fakes, uncovering hidden layers, and meticulously repairing damage. I thanked Beatrice, memorized the exact location of the hidden floorboard safe from the video, and drove back to the house we had supposedly bought to start our fresh new life together. I pulled into the driveway, taking 2 deep breaths and forcing my hands to stop shaking before I turned the key in the front door. I had to play the role of the erratic, emotional wife perfectly. Preston was standing in the grand foyer waiting for me. He looked like the absolute picture of a devoted, loving husband. He wore a soft cashmere sweater, offering me his perfect practice smile that I now knew was a complete mask. In one hand, he held a crystal glass of expensive red wine. In the other, he held 2 small capsules that he always insisted were my daily fertility vitamins. He walked toward me, his voice dripping with fake concern, asking how my afternoon errand was and insisting I take my vitamins right away to help manage my stress levels. Every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run out the door, but I knew I had to play his game until I held all the winning cards. I reached for the wine glass, intentionally making sure my fingers trembled just enough to look clumsy and uncoordinated. As he handed the glass to me, I deliberately knocked the rim hard against his wrist. The dark red liquid splashed all over his expensive sweater and shattered across the pristine hardwood floor, looking almost like blood. Preston let out a sharp, aggressive breath. His charming mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the monster underneath before he quickly caught himself and forced his smile back into place. I immediately started apologizing profusely, letting my voice pitch up in manufactured panic. I babbled frantically about being so clumsy and needing to get towels. Before he could stop me or force the pills into my hand, I bolted straight up the stairs and into the master bathroom, locking the heavy oak door firmly behind me. I turned the sink faucet on full blast to drown out any noise. Leaning against the cold marble counter, staring at my pale reflection, the terrifying reality set in. For months, I had believed the narrative they were feeding me. I thought my grief over losing my baby was making me lose my grip on reality. I thought the brain fog and exhaustion were my own fault. Now, knowing it was chemical, knowing it was deliberate, the sorrow evaporated. In its place, a cold and calculating rage took over. I was trapped in a house completely rigged by my enemies, married to a man actively trying to destroy my mind. But Preston had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He thought I was completely isolated. Reaching into the hidden lining of my leather tote bag, I pulled out a secure secondary phone I use solely for private art acquisitions. I quickly opened a new text message. I needed an ally, someone smart, ruthless, and entirely outside of Sylvia's sphere of influence. I typed the number for Terrence. Terrence was my brother-in-law, married to Preston's sister Camille. More importantly, he was a brilliant corporate attorney and an African-American man whom Sylvia absolutely despised. Her blatant racial prejudice and old money elitism meant she treated Terrence with constant, barely concealed disrespect, often making snide remarks about his background at family dinners. I knew Terrence saw right through the family's fake perfection. I typed my message with flying fingers. I need you at my house right now. Bring a professional bug sweeper. Do not tell your wife, and absolutely do not tell Preston. I hit send, gripping the edge of the sink as I waited for the battle to begin. I gripped the edges of the cold marble sink until my knuckles turned completely white. I forced myself to take slow and deep breaths to steady my racing heart. I needed to look like the erratic and emotional woman they desperately wanted me to be. I messed up my hair slightly to appear appropriately distressed, splashed some cold water on my flushed cheeks, and unlocked the heavy bathroom door. I walked down the grand staircase with my head bowed, acting like a terrified child who had just broken a priceless family heirloom. Preston had already wiped up the spilled red wine. His mother, Sylvia, was now standing next to him in the foyer. She was holding a damp towel with a look of pure and unfiltered disgust, twisting her wrinkled face. I mumbled another string of frantic apologies, telling them my nerves were just so frayed lately, and my hands simply would not stop shaking. Preston sighed heavily, wrapping a comforting but restrictive arm around my shoulders, while shooting a knowing, sinister glance at his mother. Just as Sylvia opened her mouth to criticize my clumsiness and my absolute lack of grace, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the grand foyer. Preston frowned deeply. We were not expecting any visitors. He opened the heavy wooden door, and there stood Terence, holding an expensive bottle of vintage champagne wrapped in a silk ribbon. Sylvia immediately crossed her arms over her chest. Her face twisted into an ugly sneer as she looked Terence up and down. She never missed an opportunity to make him feel entirely unwelcome in her presence. She loudly questioned why he was taking time away from his diversity quota job at the law firm just to drop off a bottle of liquor. She made a pointed and cruel remark about how people from his side of town always felt the desperate need to overcompensate with flashy gifts when they were around real wealth. Terence did not even flinch. He adjusted his perfectly tailored suit jacket and offered a smile so sharp it could cut glass. He calmly reminded her that as a senior partner at a top-tier corporate firm, his time was actually quite valuable, which was exactly why he only planned to stay for a single minute. Terence walked right past Sylvia and approached me. He held out the champagne bottle with a warm expression. As I reached for it, he pulled me into a brief but incredibly firm hug. He whispered that I was looking a bit pale and needed to take very good care of myself. In that same split second, I felt his hand slide smoothly into the pocket of my oversized cardigan. A small and heavy object dropped inside. My heart raced wildly against my ribs, but I kept my face completely blank, stepping back and thanking him for his thoughtfulness. Preston quickly stepped between us, physically blocking Terence from getting any closer to me. He placed a hand flat on Terence's chest, pushing him back toward the front door. Preston used his most condescending voice, the specific tone he reserved for people he thought were completely beneath him. He thanked Terence for stopping by, but insisted that my mind was far too fragile since the tragic miscarriage last year. Preston actually looked Terence in the eye and said they needed to keep certain stressful elements away from me for my own good. The racial undertone and the blatant disrespect hung heavily in the air, thick and suffocating. Terence looked at Preston's hand on his chest, then looked directly over his shoulder into my eyes. It was a hardened, knowing look that communicated 1,000 words without a single sound being made. He nodded slowly, stepped back onto the porch, and told Preston to take very good care of his wife. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone again, with the two people actively plotting my destruction. I spent the rest of the evening playing my part flawlessly. I acted exhausted, easily confused, and overly emotional. I let Preston guide me to bed early, accepting a cup of herbal tea I pretended to drink, but secretly poured into a potted fern when he turned his back. I lay awake in the dark, listening to his breathing slow and steady into a deep sleep. Around 2 a.m, I carefully slipped out from under the heavy down comforter. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the device Terence had smuggled to me. It was a professional-grade bug sweeper compact and completely silent. I turned it on, keeping the vibration setting active so it would not make a single noise. I started in the master bedroom, moving the device slowly along the baseboards and behind the bedside tables. It vibrated aggressively near the reading lamp on my side of the bed. I carefully inspected the fixture and found a tiny microphone hidden perfectly inside the fabric shade. A cold shiver ran down my spine. They were recording my sleep, my private phone calls, my quietest tears. I crept downstairs, navigating the massive dark house entirely barefoot. I swept the living room and found another microphone taped tightly underneath the glass coffee table. But the real violation was waiting in my art studio. This was my sanctuary, the one place in the house that was supposedly mine alone, where I restored priceless antiques and managed my secret business. The sweeper vibrated wildly near my heavy wooden restoration desk. I found a microscopic audio bug embedded right next to my chemical solvents. They wanted to hear every business deal I negotiated and every private client I spoke to. They wanted total surveillance over my $15 million company so they could steal it out from under me. Sitting on the cold floor of my studio in the pitch black, I realized the absolute magnitude of their trap. They had wrapped me in a suffocating web of surveillance, intense gaslighting, and chemical manipulation. If I showed even a hint of my true intelligence, they would know. If I tried to pack a bag and leave the house, they would hear me and call the police to execute their psychiatric hold immediately. I could not run. I had to stay right here in the center of their spider web. I had to become the very thing they were trying to turn me into. I realized with chilling clarity that I had to play the part of the crazy, fragile wife more perfectly than any actress ever could. I was going to let them think they were winning, right up until the exact moment I destroyed their entire world. The morning sun felt like a harsh spotlight rather than a comfort. I woke up knowing my own house was fully bugged, so I started the day by immediately stepping into my role. I walked into the kitchen purposefully, leaving the refrigerator door wide open and pouring my hot coffee into a soup bowl instead of a mug. Preston walked in a few minutes later, his face lighting up with a sickeningly sweet smile. He gently took the bowl from my hands and sighed deeply. He played the part of the patient, exhausted husband, dealing with a broken wife perfectly. I mumbled a confused apology, forcing a vacant look into my eyes. His gaslighting tactics escalated with terrifying speed over the next 48 hours. First, he went after my short-term memory. I always kept my car keys on the brass hook right by the front door. When I needed to run to the art supply store, they were gone. I spent a full hour frantically searching the house. I made sure to let my voice rise in panic so the hidden microphones would pick up every single note of my distress. Preston eventually walked into the kitchen and magically found them sitting inside the microwave. He gave me a look of deep, condescending pity, asking softly if I remembered putting them there. I forced heavy tears into my eyes, burying my face in my hands, and acted completely terrified of my own deteriorating mind. Then he went after my livelihood. I logged into my laptop to check my secure client portal. Half of my crucial business emails were gone, deleted, permanently wiped from the trash folder. But his most dangerous and calculated move happened inside my art studio. I was preparing to clean a delicate 19th century oil painting. I reached for my specialized restoration solvent, a highly specific chemical mixture I had formulated myself. I poured a small amount onto a testing cloth, but it did not smell right. The harsh chemical odor was completely absent. I touched the cloth and realized it was just plain tap water. Preston had deliberately swapped out my chemicals fully, hoping I would use the wrong mixture, ruin a priceless antique piece, and destroy my professional credibility in the art world. I wanted to scream and smash everything in the room, but I remembered the audio bug hidden right next to my desk. Instead, I let out a loud, frustrated sob. I purposefully knocked a few empty glass bottles to the floor, giving him the exact audio performance of a mental breakdown that he craved. The real test of my acting skills came the very next afternoon. Mr. Montgomery, one of my wealthiest and most connected clients, dropped by the house unannounced to check on the progress of a French landscape painting. Preston answered the door before I could even make it down the stairs. I stopped in the hallway just in time to hear Preston speaking in a hushed, tragic whisper. He told Mr. Montgomery that my mental health had taken a severe and sudden downturn since the miscarriage last year. He painted a picture of a woman who is confused, erratic, and rapidly losing her grip on reality. When I stepped into the foyer, Preston rushed to my side, wrapping a suffocating protective arm tightly around my waist. I played my part flawlessly. I stammered over my words, looked around the room nervously, and gave Mr. Montgomery a blank, vacant stare. I apologized for the delay on his painting, claiming my memory had been failing me lately, and I was just so very tired. Mr. Montgomery looked incredibly uncomfortable. He offered his deepest sympathies to Preston, patting my husband on the shoulder, as if he were a valiant hero for dealing with such a heavy burden. Preston soaked up the sympathy, acting like the devoted husband, sacrificing his own happiness for his sick wife. As soon as Mr. Montgomery left and Preston drove off to his investment firm, fully satisfied that he had successfully humiliated me, I dropped the crazy wife act entirely. My posture straightened, and my tears dried instantly. I went straight into the master bathroom, turned the shower on full blast to mask any possible sound, and pulled out the old burner phone Beatrice had provided. I made sure not to use my home Wi-Fi or any device Preston could monitor. I logged directly into the encrypted financial portal for my private auction house. Operating fast and with absolute precision, I executed a legal protocol I had prepared for extreme corporate emergencies. I initiated a total transfer of all my business assets, real estate holdings, and liquid cash. I moved every single cent into a blind, untouchable offshore trust based in the Cayman Islands. I locked the entire trust behind a complex legal firewall that required my physical presence and biometric verification to alter. Let Preston try to steal my $15 million company now. Whenever he finally managed to access my accounts, he would find nothing but an empty, useless shell. I hid the burner phone back in the secret lining of my tote bag, turned off the shower, and walked downstairs. I was mentally preparing my next move when the heavy front door swung wide open without a single knock. Sylvia marched right into the grand foyer. She was wearing a sharp designer coat, followed closely by a hired driver who was carrying 3 large suitcases. She did not even bother to look at me as she peeled off her leather gloves. She loudly announced that Preston had called her begging for help because I was clearly becoming a massive danger to myself. She declared that she was moving in permanently to take care of her poor, sick daughter-in-law. My eyes immediately locked onto the 3rd suitcase the driver set down on the floor. It was a heavy, reinforced metal lockbox. I knew exactly what was inside. It was the same bag I had seen on the hidden camera footage. It was the bag packed with the mysterious white powder she fully intended to use to drug me into total oblivion. I stared at that heavy metal lockbox resting on my foyer floor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Sylvia did not even attempt to hide her disdain. She kicked the lockbox casually under the console table, turning her sharp, calculating gaze toward me. She loudly declared that I looked absolutely ghastly and commanded me to go upstairs and rest. She told Preston she would take over managing the household because I was clearly too fragile and incompetent to handle even the most basic tasks. I kept my head bowed, forcing my hands to tremble as I clutched my cardigan and meekly walked up the grand staircase. Once I was safely locked inside the master bathroom with the shower running, I pulled out my secure burner phone. I texted Terrence a quick update about Sylvia moving in with the chemical supplies. His reply came seconds later, telling me to stay sharp and record everything. The very next morning, the psychological warfare escalated to a terrifying new level. I walked into the dining room to find Preston sitting at the long mahogany table with a tall, gaunt man in a perfectly tailored suit. A black leather medical bag rested by his feet. Preston stood up wearing his mask of the tragic, devoted husband. He gently took my hand and introduced the man as Dr. Mercer, claiming he was a top-tier psychiatric specialist brought in to help me through my difficult transition. I immediately recognized the trap. They were bringing the fake evaluation right into my home. I slipped my hand into my pocket and blindly pressed the record button on my hidden burner phone. Dr. Mercer gestured for me to sit down. His voice was dripping with manufactured empathy, but his eyes were cold and vacant. He began the evaluation with extreme condescension, speaking to me as if I were a confused toddler. He did not ask about my physical health. Instead, he zeroed in straight on my deepest trauma. He brought up my miscarriage from last year, his tone invasive and cruel. He suggested that the grief had been too much for my fragile mind to process. He told me that my brain had essentially fractured to protect itself, resulting in severe delusions, paranoia, and a complete break from reality. He twisted every normal human emotion I had experienced over the past year into clinical proof of psychosis. I knew exactly what Preston and Sylvia wanted to see. I let my breathing hitch. I forced hot tears to spill down my cheeks, burying my face in my hands and letting out a loud, pathetic sob. I acted entirely devastated, nodding along helplessly, as Dr. Mercer wrote extensive fabricated notes on his thick clipboard. Preston rubbed my back, performing his role flawlessly for the corrupt doctor he had hired. Just as Dr. Mercer was diagnosing me with severe schizophrenia, the heavy brass front door chimed. Before Preston could even stand up, the dining room doors swung open. Terrence walked right in looking sharp and commanding in his charcoal corporate suit. Sylvia immediately rushed out from the kitchen, her face contorting with rage. She demanded to know why he was barging into her son's home uninvited. She threw another blatant racial microaggression his way, telling him that people of his background clearly lacked the basic manners required for polite society. Terrence ignored her completely. He smoothly stepped around Sylvia and announced he needed Preston to sign off on a routine corporate tax filing for the family portfolio. He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the room, landing deliberately on the leather medical bag and the clipboard. He casually introduced himself to Dr. Mercer as the family's senior legal counsel, making sure to emphasize his authority. Preston looked furious but trapped. He could not easily kick out a high-powered corporate attorney without looking incredibly suspicious, especially not when Terrence was directly tied to their family finances. Terrence pulled out his phone, pretending to look for a specific tax email. I kept my face buried in my hands, sobbing quietly, but I felt my burner phone vibrate in my cardigan pocket. I carefully shifted my weight, slipping my hand into my pocket to read the screen. Terrence had just texted me. The message was short and chilling. He is not a doctor. I just ran his face through my corporate legal database. His medical license was permanently revoked 3 years ago for illegally prescribing heavy narcotics. He is buried in debt and owes Preston's investment firm over $2 million. He is a paid actor. Do exactly what I say. My blood ran completely cold. This man had no legal authority to diagnose anyone, but Preston was going to use his fraudulent paperwork to lock me away. Dr. Mercer cleared his throat, declaring that I required immediate and intensive psychiatric care. Preston looked at me with fake tears shining in his eyes. He knelt beside my chair, telling me that he loved me so much and just wanted me to get better. He said we could start treatment immediately right here at home. All I needed to do was sign a routine medical consent form to authorize the specialized care plan. Preston reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. He placed a single official-looking medical cover sheet on top, pointing directly to the dotted signature line at the bottom. He shoved a heavy gold pen into my shaking hand, urging me to sign it for my own good. Before the pen could even touch the paper, Terrence stepped forward. He smoothly pulled the heavy clipboard right out of Preston's hands, under the guise of reviewing the legal liability language for the family. Terrence's eyes scanned the document rapidly. With his thumb, he subtly shifted the top medical cover page just a fraction of an inch, revealing the dense, heavy legal text printed on the second page. Because I was sitting right next to him, I saw the bold capitalized heading printed at the top of the hidden document. It was not a medical consent form. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable, and total financial power of attorney. Preston was trying to trick me into legally stripping away every single right I had. He wanted total control over my bank accounts, my real estate, and my $15 million auction house. Preston snatched the clipboard aggressively back from Terrence, his jaw clenched with barely contained rage. He shoved the clipboard back in front of me, glaring at Terrence with pure hatred, and demanded I sign it immediately. Sylvia stepped up right behind my chair, crossing her arms, watching me like a hawk waiting for its prey to die. I stared down at the gold pen in my trembling hand. I looked up at Terrence, whose eyes were locked onto mine. I was completely cornered. If I refused to sign that document, they would instantly know I was fully coherent, completely sane, and aware of their entire scheme. They would drop the medical act and likely resort to something far more violent. But if I signed my name on that dotted line, I would hand my entire life and my multi-million-dollar company directly over to the monsters trying to destroy me. I stared at the heavy gold pen Preston was shoving into my trembling hand. I looked at the metal barrel, feeling the absolute weight of the trap closing around me. Terrence stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on mine, waiting to see how I would navigate this impossible corner. If I refused to sign that document, my entire facade of mental instability would instantly shatter. They would know I was fully coherent and aware of their scheme, and they would likely resort to something far more violent to get my signature. But if I signed it, I would hand over my entire life. I let out a ragged, high-pitched breath and deliberately dropped the gold pen onto the mahogany table. It clattered loudly. I scrambled backward in my chair, wrapping my arms tightly around myself, and began to rock back and forth. I babbled frantically that the pen was too heavy, that the gold felt wrong against my skin, and that I could not sign anything unless I used my own special pen. I let the tears spill freely down my cheeks, acting like a woman completely losing her grip on reality. Preston rolled his eyes, letting out a sharp sigh of profound annoyance. He looked at Dr. Mercer with an apologetic shrug, silently communicating how exhausting I was to deal with. Sylvia scoffed loudly from behind me, muttering about my pathetic and childish antics. I reached deep into the pocket of my oversized cardigan. When I was sweeping my art studio for hidden microphones the night before, I had grabbed a highly specialized restoration tool. It looked exactly like a standard black felt tip pen, but it was filled with professional-grade disappearing ink. Art restorers use it for temporary grid mapping on canvas. It vanishes completely without a trace after exactly 48 hours when exposed to ambient room temperature. I pulled the black pen from my pocket, clutching it like a lifeline. I leaned over the clipboard, my hand shaking violently for their benefit. I scrawled my signature across the dotted line of the medical cover sheet, pressing hard enough that the ink bled through to the hidden power of attorney document beneath it. I signed away my bank accounts, my real estate, and my $15 million auction house. But I knew that in exactly 2 days that signature would completely evaporate into thin air. As soon as I lifted the pen, Preston snatched the clipboard away with lightning speed. The fake concern vanished from his face, replaced by a look of hungry, predatory triumph. He handed the clipboard directly to Dr. Mercer, thanking him for his thorough evaluation and promising to wire his payment by the end of the week. Sylvia stepped out from behind my chair. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered venom. She leaned in close, her voice a harsh whisper meant only for my ears, while Preston was distracted by walking the fraudulent doctor to the front door. She sneered, telling me that finally I had done something useful for their family. She bragged that they only ever tolerated my low-class background because they needed my initial startup money years ago. She practically hissed that my little art business was going to be liquidated by the end of the month to cover the massive financial losses Preston had taken in the market. She told me I was nothing but a liability now, and the psychiatric ward would be my permanent home by next week. I kept my head down, forcing a pathetic whimper past my lips, playing the broken victim. But inside, my mind was racing with terrifying speed. Massive financial losses. Preston was supposed to be a top-tier wealth manager at a prestigious firm. If he was bleeding money, it explained the sudden desperate rush to steal my company. Terrence adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his face an impenetrable mask of corporate stoicism. He told Preston he would file the necessary tax paperwork and let himself out. But as he walked past my chair, he deliberately dropped his heavy leather portfolio on the floor. As he bent down to pick it up, his fingers quickly brushed against my ankle. He slipped a tiny folded piece of paper directly into my shoe. I waited until Preston and Sylvia were busy celebrating their supposed victory in the kitchen with a bottle of expensive champagne. I locked myself in the master bathroom, turned the shower on full blast to mask any noise, and pulled the tiny slip of paper from my shoe. It was an encrypted IP address and a passcode. I pulled out my secure burner phone and typed in the credentials. Terrence had granted me temporary access to a secure private legal server. What I saw on that small screen made my blood run completely cold. Terrence had used his position as the family's senior legal counsel to intercept Preston's deeply buried banking records. Preston was not just suffering from a few bad investments, he was running a massive, catastrophic Ponzi scheme. He had been using new investor money to pay off older clients for years, and the entire house of cards was finally collapsing. But the most horrifying part was the source of his recent funds. Preston had completely drained his own family's accounts to keep the criminal scheme afloat. I scrolled through the wire transfers in absolute shock. He had stolen millions from his wealthy clients, yes, but he had also stolen directly from his sister Camille. He had completely wiped out the college savings accounts for Terrence and Camille's children. Preston was a desperate, cornered animal. He was willing to destroy my mind and lock me in an asylum just to use my company as a temporary bandage for his monumental crimes. And Sylvia was helping him do it. She was fully aware that her beloved son was stealing from her own daughter and her African-American son-in-law. They were willing to destroy everyone around them to protect their wealthy facade, but they were about to learn what happens when you corner a woman with nothing left to lose. I had to get out of the house to meet Terrence and Camille. I played the heavily medicated defeated wife the next morning. I told Preston I needed to go to the pharmacy to pick up the new prescriptions Dr. Mercer had supposedly called in. Preston bloated with arrogance and completely convinced he held my entire $15 million company in his hands, with that forged signature tossed me my car keys. He told me not to take too long and to drive carefully, acting like a benevolent warden, granting a prisoner a brief walk in the yard. I drove straight to a secure private conference room Terrence had rented under a dummy corporation in downtown Chicago. When I walked through the frosted glass doors, Terrence was already pacing the room. Sitting at the long mahogany table was Camille Preston's younger sister. Camille was a woman raised in the same suffocating elitist environment as Preston, but she had always shown a glimmer of independence mostly by marrying Terrence against Sylvia's fierce, unspoken objections. Right now, however, Camille looked entirely defensive. Her designer handbag was clutched tightly in her lap, and her posture was rigid. When I sat down, Camille immediately went on the offensive. She told me she was deeply sorry about my mental health struggles and my miscarriage, but she did not understand why Terrence had dragged her to a secret meeting away from her children. She said Preston had warned the entire family that I was becoming paranoid and that I was trying to turn everyone against him. She looked at Terrence with betrayal in her eyes, asking how he could entertain my delusions. Terrence did not argue with her. He simply opened his heavy laptop and turned the screen toward his wife. He told Camille that he loved her, but she needed to look at the numbers. Terrence pulled up the exact banking records he had intercepted from Preston's supposedly secure servers. He guided Camille's eyes to the specific offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, and the desperate, frantic wire transfers Preston had been making to silence furious investors. Then Terrence opened a very specific subfolder. It contained the financial statements for their twins' college trust funds. Camille stared at the screen. The accounts were completely empty. Over the past 18 months, Preston had systematically drained every single dollar from his own niece and nephew's college savings. He had funneled his sister's money directly into his collapsing Ponzi scheme. Camille shook her head, her voice trembling. She tried to rationalize it. She said Preston was a financial genius. She insisted it was just a temporary reallocation of assets, a sophisticated wealth management strategy that they simply did not understand. She said her brother would never steal from his own blood. That was my cue. I reached into my bag and pulled out my secure burner phone. I told Camille that I knew it was impossible to believe that the people who raised her could be monsters. I told her I had refused to believe it myself until I heard it with my own ears. I tapped the screen and played the audio file I had extracted from the hidden camera Beatrice had left in my library. The pristine acoustics of the conference room amplified Sylvia's sharp, cruel voice. The recording captured a conversation between Sylvia and Preston from just 2 days ago. Sylvia was complaining about having to attend a dinner at Camille and Terrence's house. Sylvia's voice dripped with pure, concentrated venom. She explicitly insulted Camille's marriage. She used vile, racially charged language to describe Terrence, mocking his background and his presence in their aristocratic family. She coldly stated that Camille was a naive, embarrassing fool who had ruined the family bloodline. Then came the killing blow. Preston asked his mother why she even bothered showing up to Camille's dinners if she hated Terrence so much. Sylvia laughed a dry, wicked laugh. She told Preston she only tolerated having a black son-in-law because Terrence was a high-powered corporate attorney with a massive network of wealthy clients. She explicitly said that keeping Terrence around was the only way Preston could access those clients and quietly siphon away Terrence's personal savings to keep their family from going bankrupt. Sylvia literally referred to Terrence and Camille as nothing more than a convenient disposable bank account. I stopped the recording. The silence in the conference room was so heavy it felt hard to breathe. I watched Camille's entire worldview shatter into a million jagged pieces. The denial vanished from her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not bother to wipe it away. She stared at the blank laptop screen, processing the absolute betrayal. Her brother had stolen her children's future. Her mother viewed her marriage as a disgusting joke and her husband as a tool to be exploited. When Camille finally looked up, the sadness was entirely gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying, and absolute rage. It was the kind of wrath that only a woman who has been betrayed by her own blood can summon. She reached across the table and grabbed Terrence's hand, holding it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked at him and quietly apologized for ever doubting him. Then Camille turned her piercing gaze to me. Her voice was steady and devoid of any emotion. She asked me when Preston was forcing me to host the massive housewarming gala he had been bragging about to their social circle. I told her it was this coming Saturday night. Preston wanted to use the grand estate to impress a new wave of investors and show off his supposedly perfect life. Camille nodded slowly, a dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. She said that was absolutely perfect. She declared that we were going to let Preston and Sylvia put on their spectacular little show for all their high society friends. We were going to let them feel like they had won everything. And then, in front of the most powerful people in Chicago, we were going to burn their entire lives to the ground. Terrence pulled out a fresh legal pad. I pulled up the architectural blueprints Beatrice had given me. Together, the three of us leaned over the mahogany table and began to outline the master plan. We were going to turn my beautiful new home into the ultimate trap. 48 hours. That was the exact window required for the specialized restoration ink to completely evaporate from the heavy legal paper. I spent those 2 days moving like a ghost through my own home. I wore oversized knit sweaters, kept my eyes fixed firmly on the hardwood floor, and let Sylvia direct my every waking move. She fed me the laced meals she prepared with the mysterious white powder, which I continued to secretly swap or dispose of when she turned her back. Preston walked around the estate with his chest puffed out. He thought he had won. He thought he held the keys to my $15 million auction house right in his manicured hands. Terrence texted me the play-by-play updates from his secure server. He and Camille were tracking Preston's financial movements closely. Preston walked into the most exclusive branch of our bank downtown, carrying himself like a king. He bypassed the regular tellers and marched straight into the office of the senior branch manager. He slapped the heavy leather folder onto the mahogany desk, demanding an immediate expedited wire transfer of $5 million to a series of offshore shell companies. These were the dummy accounts he desperately needed to appease the furious investors of his collapsing Ponzi scheme. The branch manager opened the folder. He flipped past the fraudulent medical cover sheet. He looked down at the signature line on the irrevocable power of attorney. It was completely blank. Not a single trace of ink remained. The manager politely informed Preston that he could not authorize a $5 million wire transfer or grant access to my corporate holdings with a blank sheet of paper. Terrence later told me that Preston completely lost his composure. He shouted at the manager, accusing the bank of tampering with the documents, before snatching the folder and storming out of the building. I was sitting in the living room pretending to read a lifestyle magazine upside down when the heavy oak front door slammed open with the force of an explosion. Preston stormed into the foyer. His face was a violent, splotchy red. The charming, calculated wealth manager was entirely gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered animal. His phone was vibrating constantly in his pocket, undoubtedly ringing with calls from angry investors demanding their stolen money. He marched straight into the living room and grabbed me by the arm, yanking me up from the sofa with enough force to bruise. He shoved the crumpled power of attorney document directly into my face. He screamed at the top of his lungs, asking what kind of sick trick I was playing. He demanded to know how I had erased my signature. Sylvia rushed into the room from the kitchen, demanding to know why her son was shouting. Preston shoved the blank paper at her. Sylvia gasped, her face turning pale as she stared at the empty dotted line. She looked at me with pure hatred, taking a menacing step forward. I knew this was the exact moment that would either save my life or ruin my entire plan. I collapsed backward onto the sofa, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. I let out a high-pitched wail, burying my face in my hands. I shook violently from head to toe. I cried out that I did not understand what was happening. I swore repeatedly that I had signed the paper. I sobbed, telling them that the bank must have lost the real document, or maybe my mind really was completely gone, and I only imagined signing it. I babbled frantically, asking Preston if I was going crazy, begging him to protect me from my own broken brain. I gave them the exact performance of a shattered, delusional woman. Preston paced the room, running his hands aggressively through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at Sylvia, pure panic radiating from his eyes. He muttered that he had furious clients expecting their returns by Monday morning. If he did not secure that $5 million, the federal authorities would be knocking on his door. He could not afford a lengthy legal battle over a missing signature. He needed the money transferred right now, today. Sylvia grabbed his shoulder, telling him to calm down and think. She said they could just print another copy and force me to sign it again. But Preston shook his head wildly. He explained that the bank manager was already highly suspicious after the outburst in his office. A new document brought in by a frantic husband without the wife present would trigger an immediate fraud alert. Preston stopped pacing. He looked down at me, his breathing heavy and ragged. He knelt in front of the sofa, forcing his voice to soften into a sickeningly sweet tone that made my skin crawl. He stroked my hair, apologizing for raising his voice and scaring me. He told me the bank must have made a terrible administrative error. But we were going to fix it together, he said. He smiled a desperate, wild smile. He announced that he was going to invite the senior bank manager as a VIP guest to our massive housewarming gala this coming Saturday. He told me that I was going to sit down with the manager in my private study during the party, and I was going to sign a fresh copy of the document right in front of his eyes. He said it would be a quick, painless formality to ensure my business was managed properly while I focused on resting. I nodded meekly, letting tears spill down my cheeks, promising I would do whatever he asked to be a good wife. I buried my face in his chest to hide the sharp, lethal smile spreading across my lips. Preston thought he was brilliantly securing his stolen millions. He had no idea he had just invited the final crucial witness to his own spectacular destruction. The 48 hours leading up to the grand housewarming gala felt like a ticking time bomb. Preston was practically vibrating with a manic, desperate energy. He spent his days locked in his home office, screaming at his frantic investors over the phone, promising them that their massive returns would be wired bright and early on Monday morning. He genuinely believed that forcing me to sign the power of attorney in front of the senior bank manager at our party would save his collapsing Ponzi scheme. He thought he had complete control. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to crumble. While Preston was distracted by his financial fires, and Terrence and Camille were busy securing the offshore financial traps I needed to secure the physical battlefield. I needed absolute control over my house. I shuffled into the kitchen wearing my oversized sweater and keeping my eyes glued to the floor. Sylvia was aggressively polishing the silver serving trays for the upcoming party. I kept my voice weak and raspy, telling her I felt suffocated and needed to take a short walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. She looked me up and down with utter repulsion. She warned me not to wander off and get lost like a brainless stray dog because they did not have the time to go searching for me. I nodded meekly and slipped out the back door. I walked exactly 4 blocks down the tree-lined suburban street until I reached the parking lot of a high-end grocery store. A sleek black SUV was idling in the very back corner. I climbed into the passenger seat and locked the door. Beatrice, the retired federal investigator and previous owner of my house, was sitting behind the wheel. She did not waste a single second. She reached into the back seat and handed me a heavy, unmarked cardboard tube and a small encrypted flash drive. Beatrice explained that when she built the estate, she designed it with a localized closed-loop central smart system. Preston believed that the digital control panel on his smartphone governed the entire property. He thought he controlled the security cameras, the electronic locks, and the massive entertainment system in the grand living room. But Beatrice smiled a sharp, calculating smile. She told me Preston only had guest access. The true master server was physical, and it was hidden behind a false wall in the basement utility room. She handed me the architectural blueprints and gave me the master administrative override codes. I thanked her, tucked the tube securely beneath my heavy sweater, and walked back into the lion's den. I waited until midnight. Preston was passed out in the master bedroom, exhausted from lying to his clients all day. Sylvia had taken her sleeping pills and was snoring loudly down the hall. I crept out of bed, completely barefoot, and navigated the dark, silent house. I descended the wooden stairs into the sprawling, unfinished section of the basement. The air was damp and smelled faintly of copper pipes. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and unfolded Beatrice's heavy blueprints. Following her exact measurements, I walked past the massive water heaters and the electrical panels until I reached a blank concrete wall tucked in the furthest, darkest corner of the utility closet. I ran my fingers along the rough surface until I found a slight indentation. I pushed hard against the concrete. With a heavy metallic click, a hidden steel access panel swung open. Inside was a glowing rack of digital servers, the real brain of my $3 million estate. I plugged Beatrice's encrypted flash drive directly into the master port. I pulled out my secure burner phone and typed in the command codes she had provided. Line by line, I systematically stripped Preston of his digital authority. I bypassed his administrator access without triggering a single alert on his phone. I rerouted the massive 80-inch smart screen and the integrated surround sound audio system in the grand living room, linking them directly to my burner phone. Finally, I overrode the magnetic locking mechanisms on the heavy mahogany front doors. I set a program that would allow me to lock them down or throw them wide open with a single tap of my finger. I now owned the house entirely. The ultimate trap for the gala was perfectly set. I reached out to unplug the flash drive, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline and triumph. But in that exact second, the wooden stairs leading down to the basement groaned loudly under a heavy footstep. My blood ran completely ice cold. I quickly yanked the flash drive from the port and shoved it deep into my pocket. The harsh, blinding glare of the overhead basement lights flickered on. Sylvia's sharp, cruel voice echoed through the damp concrete room. She demanded to know who was down there. She marched past the storage boxes, her footsteps growing louder and more aggressive. I was trapped in the dead end of the utility closet. The hidden steel access panel to the servers was still wide open, exposing the glowing blue lights. If she saw the server rack, she would instantly know I was not a mentally declining victim. She would know I was planning something highly technical and deeply coordinated. I had less than 3 seconds to react. I slammed the steel panel shut with my shoulder dropping forcefully to the cold concrete floor right in front of it. I pulled my knees tightly against my chest and began to rock back and forth violently. I wrapped my arms around my head and started scratching aggressively at my own forearms. Sylvia turned the corner and stopped dead in her tracks. She looked down at me, her face twisting in absolute disgust. I let out a loud, pathetic whimper. I kept my eyes wide and frantic, staring at the blank concrete wall behind me. I babbled hysterically, forcing tears to stream down my face. I cried out that the humming from the pipes was too loud, that the walls were whispering horrible things to me, and that I just needed a dark place to hide from the voices in my head. I begged her to make the noise stop, giving her the exact pitiful performance of a woman who had completely lost her mind. Sylvia let out a harsh, wicked laugh. She did not look at the wall behind me. She only looked at the broken, pathetic creature crying on her basement floor. She reached down, grabbing my arm roughly and yanking me to my feet with surprising strength. She dug her manicured nails into my skin, her eyes flashing with pure malice. She told me I was a disgusting, embarrassing mess. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of bitter wine, and whispered that I only had to survive 2 more days. She promised me that after the gala on Saturday night, I would be dragged out of her son's beautiful house and locked inside a padded, sterile cell exactly where a low-class lunatic like me belonged. I kept my head bowed, letting out another manufactured sob as she forcefully dragged me up the basement stairs. I let her shove me back toward the master bedroom. I played the terrified victim perfectly, but beneath my tears and my trembling hands, my heart was beating with a steady, lethal rhythm. Sylvia thought she was marching me toward my absolute ruin. She had no idea she was simply counting down the hours to her own spectacular destruction. Sylvia shoved me roughly into the master bedroom and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me. I stumbled forward, intentionally catching myself on the edge of the mattress and letting out one final pathetic sob for her benefit. I listened closely as her sharp footsteps faded down the hallway. The moment the sound disappeared, my tears dried instantly. I stood up straight, smoothing down my oversized sweater. My heart was beating with a steady, lethal rhythm. The digital trap in the basement was fully set, and the countdown to the grand housewarming gala had officially begun. The next 48 hours turned my beautiful $3 million estate into an absolute pressure cooker. Preston was cracking under the immense weight of his own criminal greed. His carefully crafted facade of a charming, successful wealth manager was entirely gone. He spent his days locked inside his home office, but the heavy mahogany doors could not contain the sounds of his escalating panic. I would shuffle past his office, keeping my head bowed, and hear the frantic, aggressive tone of his voice as he screamed at his high society investors over the phone. He was lying through his teeth, promising them that their massive returns were secured and would be wired first thing Monday morning, but his investors were losing patience. Whenever he left his office to pour himself another drink, I could hear the threatening voicemails echoing from his answering machine. Angry, powerful people were demanding their money. Preston was unraveling fast. He started day drinking, pouring generous glasses of scotch before noon. His hands shook constantly, and a thick layer of cold sweat coated his forehead. He snapped at Sylvia over the smallest things, pacing the grand foyer like a trapped animal. He truly believed that the upcoming gala was his only lifeline. He was convinced that if he could just force me to sign the power of attorney in front of the senior bank manager during the party, he could steal my $15 million auction house and use my company's assets to temporarily plug the gaping holes in his Ponzi scheme. While Preston was drowning in his own financial fires, I was locked in the master bathroom coordinating the final fatal strike. I pulled my secure burner phone from the lining of my tote bag and texted Terrence. Terrence was not just a brilliant corporate attorney. He was a man fighting for the future of his own family. Preston had stolen every single cent of the college savings accounts belonging to Terrence and Camille's children. Terrence was operating with a cold, calculated wrath. Using the heavily encrypted financial records he had intercepted from Preston's servers, Terrence bypassed the usual bureaucratic channels. He walked directly into the federal building in downtown Chicago. Terrence handed over a mountain of undeniable, airtight evidence to the highest-ranking agents at the FBI and the IRS. He provided them with the offshore account numbers, the dummy corporations, and the exact paper trail of the stolen millions. He showed them how Preston was running a massive, catastrophic fraud operation, stealing from his own elite clients and his own flesh and blood. The federal agents did not hesitate. Given the sheer magnitude of the financial crimes and the flight risk Preston posed, they immediately authorized a full-scale raid. Terrence texted me the confirmation. The operation was greenlit. We just needed to coordinate the exact timing. We agreed that the perfect moment to strike would be when Preston felt the most powerful. The raid would commence on Saturday night, timed to coincide perfectly with Preston's grand speech to his wealthy guests. I deleted the messages, cleared the burner phone's cache, and hid the device away. I walked back out into the hallway, resuming my role as the terrified, broken wife. Sylvia was bustling around the main floor, barking orders at the catering staff and the decorators she had hired for the gala. She was aggressively micromanaging the placement of the floral arrangements and the crystal champagne towers. It was a sick, twisted irony. She was throwing the most extravagant party imaginable to impress the exact same people her son was actively robbing. She wanted to show off her old money status, completely blind to the fact that her entire world was about to be seized by the federal government. By Friday evening, the tension in the house was suffocating. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall when Preston marched into the bedroom. He reeked of expensive scotch and cheap desperation. His eyes were bloodshot and his jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He walked over to the bed and threw a garment bag roughly onto the mattress. He unzipped it, pulling out a dress, and held it up for me to see. It was not a gown meant for a high society gala. It was a shapeless, pale gray dress made of a stiff, uncomfortable fabric. It looked like a vintage hospital gown or a uniform you would wear in a bleak institutional facility. The color was entirely washed out, designed specifically to drain the life from my complexion and make me look severely ill. Preston looked down at me, his voice a harsh, demanding whisper. He told me I was going to wear this exact dress to the party tomorrow night. He explicitly stated that he wanted the bank manager and every single wealthy guest to see how fragile and deeply unwell I had become. He wanted them to look at my pale, shapeless appearance and feel profound pity for the devoted husband who had to care for such a tragic, broken woman. He needed them to believe I was entirely incapable of managing my own life, let alone a multi-million-dollar art business. He ordered me to keep my makeup minimal, to leave my hair unstyled, and to stay quiet unless spoken to. He leaned in close, grabbing my chin with a tight, painful grip, and warned me not to ruin his night. I kept my eyes wide and frightened. I let a single tear slip down my cheek, nodding my head rapidly. I whispered a shaky promise that I would wear the dress and be a good, quiet wife. Preston let go of my chin, looking at me with total disgust before turning around and walking out of the room to pour himself another drink. The moment the door clicked shut, my fearful expression vanished. I looked at the ugly, pale gray dress lying on my bed and let out a soft, dark laugh. Preston wanted me to look like a victim. He wanted me to look like a woman who had completely lost her mind. I calmly picked up the ugly garment and tossed it into the back of my closet. I had absolutely no intention of wearing it. My real dress was already hidden safely inside my art studio, and when I walked down those grand stairs tomorrow night, I was not going to look like a patient. I was going to look like a queen ready to execute her enemies. The grand housewarming gala finally arrived on Saturday night, transforming my home into a glittering stage for Preston's ultimate deception. Over 150 of Chicago's most elite socialites, wealthy investors, and prominent family members poured through the heavy mahogany front doors. Valets parked fleets of luxury cars along the driveway, while a live string quartet played classical music from the corner of the grand living room. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. To anyone looking from the outside, it was the absolute picture of high society perfection. But I knew the truth. I knew the ground beneath this glittering party was already rigged with explosives. From my vantage point at the top of the stairs, hidden in the shadows of the second-floor hallway, I watched Sylvia hold court near the towering crystal champagne pyramid. She was wearing a heavy diamond necklace that I knew was purchased with stolen money. She leaned in close to a group of powerful investors, her face twisted into a mask of deep manufactured sorrow. I could read her lips and hear the theatrical pity in her voice. She was whispering about the devastating tragedy of her daughter-in-law's rapid mental decline. She dramatically pressed a hand to her chest, telling everyone that my mind was completely shattered, that I was prone to terrifying delusions, and that her poor son was sacrificing everything to care for me. She was preemptively explaining away the disturbing scene they planned to orchestrate later that evening. Preston was standing near the digital fireplace, aggressively gripping a glass of scotch. His smile was wide and practiced, but the muscles in his jaw were twitching uncontrollably. He kept glancing nervously at the front door, desperately waiting for the senior bank manager to arrive so he could execute the fraudulent power of attorney. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, completely unaware that a hurricane was rapidly approaching his back. I stepped away from the railing and walked quietly into my private art studio. The ugly, pale gray institutional dress Preston had ordered me to wear was still lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of my closet. I stepped right over it. I reached behind a stack of large canvas frames and pulled out the protective garment bag I had hidden there days ago. I unzipped the bag, revealing a breathtaking razor-sharp emerald green gown. It was a piece of high-fashion architecture, designed with clean lines and absolute power. I slipped the silk fabric over my shoulders. I sat at my vanity and applied my makeup with meticulous, ruthless precision. I highlighted my cheekbones, painted my lips a deep and confident crimson, and pinned my hair back into an elegant, commanding style. I did not look fragile. I did not look confused. I looked exactly like the sole owner of a $15 million auction house. I looked like a woman who held total control over her own destiny. I walked out of the studio and made my way to the top of the grand staircase. I took a deep, steadying breath and began my descent. The sharp click of my designer heels against the hardwood steps echoed through the massive foyer. One by one, the wealthy guests stopped talking and turned to look up at me. The soft chatter of the party faded into a stunned, absolute silence. I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting a serene and radiant smile grace my face. I saw Sylvia first. The glass of champagne in her hand actually tilted, spilling a few drops onto the expensive Persian rug. Her jaw dropped open in pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at my vibrant, commanding appearance and realized her narrative of the insane broken wife had just been instantly obliterated in front of half the city. Preston turned around, and the color completely drained from his face. His eyes widened in absolute fury as he took in my emerald gown and flawless makeup. But the room was full of his most important clients, and the flash of a society photographer's camera suddenly illuminated the room. Preston had absolutely no choice but to play along. He forced a wide, visibly strained smile onto his face and walked to the bottom of the stairs, extending his hand to help me down the final step. I took his hand, my grip firm and challenging. We turned to face the crowd. I greeted the investors with total clarity and eloquent charm. I engaged in sharp, intelligent conversations about the local real estate market and international art trends. The guests looked at me with deep admiration, immediately turning confused glances toward Sylvia. They were clearly wondering why she had just spent the last hour claiming I was suffering from severe schizophrenia, when I was standing right in front of them entirely sane, brilliant, and captivating. A prominent venture capitalist approached us praising my stunning dress and asking about my recent art restoration projects. I answered him with sharp technical expertise, dropping specific details about chemical solvents and historical preservation techniques that proved my mind was operating at the highest possible level. Sylvia hovered frantically on the edge of the conversation, her face turning a violent shade of red as she desperately tried to interject and steer the topic back to my health. I completely ignored her, maintaining my eye contact with the investor and projecting absolute confidence. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Terence and Camille standing near the bar. Camille was holding a glass of sparkling water, looking at me with fierce pride. Terence simply tapped 2 fingers against the face of his luxury watch. It was the silent signal. The federal agents were in position. The clock was officially counting down. Preston wrapped his arm tightly around my waist, pulling me aggressively against his side to pose for another photograph. To the crowd, we looked like the ultimate power couple. But as he leaned his head down, pretending to give me a loving kiss on the cheek, his fingers dug painfully into my ribs. His breath was hot and smelled strongly of liquor. He whispered violently right into my ear. He told me I was making a massive mistake. He said I might think a pretty dress could save me, but I was entirely wrong. He hissed that the corrupt paramedics were already parked outside in the alleyway. He promised me that the second he finished his grand speech, the act would be over, and I would be leaving my own house in a straitjacket. I did not flinch when Preston dug his fingers into my ribs. I did not let a single trace of fear show on my face when he threatened me with the paramedics waiting in the alleyway. Instead, I turned directly toward the society photographer, flashed a blinding, radiant smile, and stepped smoothly out of my husband's painful grip. I adjusted the skirt of my emerald gown with absolute grace, leaving Preston standing there with a strained, furious grimace captured forever by the camera flash. But Preston was desperate. His time was running out and his investors were circling. He grabbed my arm again, his grip tight and bruising, and steered me away from the glittering crowd in the grand foyer. He forced a wide smile for the passing guests, claiming he needed a quiet moment alone with his beautiful wife. He marched me forcefully down the hallway and shoved me into the private study, kicking the heavy mahogany doors shut behind us. Sitting behind my antique oak desk was the senior bank manager, Mr. Caldwell. He looked nervous, clutching his expensive briefcase, and sweating slightly in his tailored suit. Preston dropped his fake smile the instant the doors clicked shut. His face transformed into a mask of pure, frantic aggression. He marched over to the desk and slammed a thick leather folder down right in front of the bank manager. He ripped it open, exposing a fresh, newly printed copy of the irrevocable power of attorney. Preston grabbed my wrist and yanked me forward, forcing me into the leather chair opposite the desk. He pulled a heavy gold pen from his pocket and slammed it down directly on top of the signature line. He leaned over me, placing both hands flat on the desk, trapping me in the chair. His breath reeked of scotch and panic. He told me to sign it now. He kept his voice low but laced with absolute menace. He told me to sign it for my own good, reminding me that the medical transport team was waiting just outside the gates. He looked at Mr. Caldwell, feigning a tragic, exhausted sigh. He told the manager that my mental decline had been so rapid and heartbreaking that securing my financial assets tonight was the only way to protect my $15 million company before I was permanently institutionalized. I looked down at the blank signature line. I did not reach for the pen. I just sat perfectly still, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. Preston lost his patience. He slammed his fist against the desk, shouting at me to pick up the pen. Before the echo of his fist even faded, the heavy mahogany doors of the study swung wide open. Terrence walked into the room. He looked absolutely lethal. His charcoal corporate suit was immaculate and his posture radiated sheer, undeniable authority. Sylvia had slipped into the study right behind him, clearly hoping to witness her son's ultimate victory over my company. Her face twisted with familiar racist disgust the second she saw Terrence step past the threshold. She immediately demanded to know why he was barging into a private financial meeting, threatening to have security throw him out onto the street where he belonged. Terrence did not even spare her a glance. He walked straight up to the oak desk and pulled out his official corporate attorney credentials, dropping them heavily right on top of Preston's fraudulent power of attorney. Terrence ignored Preston entirely and locked his sharp, unforgiving eyes directly onto the senior bank manager. He introduced himself as the senior legal counsel for the family portfolio. He kept his voice perfectly level, carrying the weight of a seasoned prosecutor closing a trap. He informed Mr. Caldwell that Preston was currently the target of an active, massive federal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the IRS. He clearly and methodically explained that Preston was running a catastrophic Ponzi scheme and had already stolen millions of dollars from his own clients and family members. Preston turned a violent shade of purple. He lunged forward, screaming that Terrence was a liar and a disgruntled low-class relative trying to cause a scene. Preston demanded that the bank manager ignore him and process the signature immediately. But Terrence stood his ground, moving closer to the desk. He pointed a steady finger at the bank manager. He stated that the federal authorities were actively monitoring all of Preston's financial accounts. Terrence delivered his final devastating warning. He told Mr. Caldwell that if he authorized a single signature or transferred 1 single cent of my corporate assets tonight, Terrence's law firm would personally ensure the bank manager was indicted by the federal government as a direct accessory to wire fraud and grand larceny. Mr. Caldwell turned completely ashen. The color drained from his face as he looked from Terrence's ironclad credentials to Preston's sweating, unhinged and panicked face. The manager realized instantly that he was standing in the exact center of a massive criminal conspiracy. He did not say a single word to Preston. Mr. Caldwell frantically grabbed his briefcase, knocking his chair backward in his haste to get up. He scrambled past Sylvia, yanked the study doors open, and practically ran down the hallway, fleeing the party and abandoning Preston entirely. The heavy doors swung shut, sealing the 4 of us inside the quiet study. Preston stared at the empty doorway. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down on him. His final financial lifeline had just evaporated into thin air. The $5 million he desperately needed to pay off his furious investors was gone forever. He was trapped. He turned around slowly, His eyes locked onto Terence and then shifted to me, sitting calmly in my chair in my radiant emerald gown. His face contorted with an ugly, unhinged rage. His hands balled into tight fists, his chest heaving as his entire world began to collapse. Sylvia stepped forward from the shadows of the room. She realized instantly that the legal and financial route was completely dead. The bank manager was gone and my company was untouchable. She locked eyes with her son across the room. The desperate, unspoken communication between them was chilling. Preston gave his mother a subtle, rigid nod. The financial extortion had failed, which meant they had to skip straight to the physical takedown. It was the signal to initiate their final, desperate backup plan. Sylvia smirked. A wicked, cruel light danced in her eyes as her hand slipped deeply into her designer clutch, her fingers wrapping around the vial of the mysterious white powder. She turned on her heel and stepped quickly out of the study, heading straight for the catering station. If they could not steal my company with a pen, they were going to drug my champagne, force me to collapse in front of the entire high society crowd, and drag me out to the waiting paramedics by absolute force. I walked out of the mahogany doors of the private study with Terence right beside me. We left Preston standing alone in his collapsing reality. The heavy beat of my heart matched the classical music floating through the grand living room. The party was still in full swing. 150 wealthy guests were sipping expensive wine and laughing under the crystal chandeliers. They had no idea that a war was being fought right in front of their eyes. I scanned the glittering crowd and spotted Sylvia. She was hovering near the catering station in the corner of the room. Her back was turned to the guests. She was blocking the view of the bartenders with her body. From my vantage point, I could see the slight frantic movement of her hands. She was uncapping the small glass vial she had pulled from her designer clutch. She was dumping the mysterious white powder directly into a crystal flute of champagne. She stirred it quickly with a silver swizzle stick until the liquid was perfectly clear again. She turned around with a terrifyingly sweet smile plastered across her wrinkled face. She held two identical glasses of champagne. One was perfectly safe. The other was a chemical weapon designed to break my mind and force my body to collapse in front of half the city. Sylvia began walking toward me. Her eyes were locked onto mine with the hungry focus of a predator. She thought she was holding the key to my destruction. She did not realize she was walking straight into a trap that Camille and I had meticulously planned. Camille was standing just a few feet away from me. We did not exchange a single word, but we did not need to. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. Sylvia approached me in the center of the grand foyer. The wealthy investors parted slightly to let her through, eager to watch the interaction between the matriarch and the supposedly unstable daughter-in-law. Sylvia stopped right in front of me and held out her hand. She offered me the glass on the left. She spoke in a loud, patronizing tone designed to carry across the room. She told me I looked incredibly tense, and that a glass of champagne would help calm my fragile nerves. She said it with such manufactured pity that several guests nodded in sympathy. She wanted everyone to see her as the caring mother-in-law trying to soothe my erratic behavior. I looked at the bubbling liquid. I knew exactly what was inside it. I reached out and accepted the glass with a perfectly steady hand. I smiled warmly and thanked her for being so incredibly attentive to my needs. Sylvia smiled back, a wicked and triumphant gleam in her eye. She raised her own glass, ready to seal my fate. That was the exact moment Camille made her move. Camille stepped right up to her mother. She spoke with a loud, commanding voice that instantly drew the attention of the surrounding elite crowd. Camille told Sylvia that this was a monumental evening for the family. She insisted that Sylvia simply had to make a public toast to celebrate the new home and the family legacy. Sylvia froze. She was a woman utterly obsessed with high society validation. The opportunity to command the attention of the wealthiest people in Chicago and perform for an audience was an addiction she could never resist. She instinctively turned her head away from me to look at her daughter and the gathering crowd. She opened her mouth to begin her performative speech, basking in the sudden spotlight. She took her eyes off the glasses for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all I needed. My hands were trained by years of restoring priceless artifacts. I possessed a level of manual dexterity and fluid precision that Sylvia could not even fathom. In one smooth, invisible motion, I crossed my arms slightly. I slid the laced glass of champagne directly into Sylvia's right hand, effortlessly plucking her clean glass away in the exact same breath. The crystal flutes traded places without a single clink of glass or a spilled drop of liquid. It was a phantom movement. Sylvia turned back around to face me, completely oblivious to the swap. She raised the glass high into the air. She projected her voice across the foyer, delivering a highly hypocritical speech about the deep bonds of family unity, the importance of loyalty, and the sacrifices we make for the people we love. She looked right into my eyes as she spoke the word sacrifice. She finished her toast to thunderous applause from the oblivious guests. She brought the crystal flute to her lips and took a long, deep swallow. I watched the muscles in her throat work as she drank every last drop of the chemical poison she had intended for me. I brought my own clean glass to my lips and took a delicate sip of the crisp champagne. I smiled at her over the rim of the crystal flute. I told her it was the most spectacular toast I had ever heard. Sylvia smiled back, entirely unaware that the countdown to her own public humiliation had just begun. The potent drugs were already entering her bloodstream. It would only be a matter of minutes before the heavy narcotics hijacked her nervous system and stripped away every ounce of her aristocratic control. Before Sylvia could say another word, the heavy mahogany doors of the private study slammed open. Preston marched out into the hallway. His face was pale, glistening with a thick layer of cold sweat. The bank manager had fled. The $5 million he desperately needed to hide his Ponzi scheme was gone. He was operating on pure, unadulterated panic. But he saw me standing in the foyer holding a half-empty glass of champagne, with Sylvia standing right beside me. Preston assumed the backup plan had worked perfectly. He believed I had just ingested a massive dose of hallucinogenic drugs. He thought I was about to drop to the floor in a psychotic episode, allowing him to call in his corrupt paramedics and seize medical control of my entire life. Preston grabbed a silver spoon from a passing waiter. He struck it sharply against his empty glass. The loud ringing cut through the classical music and the wealthy chatter. The entire room fell completely silent. All 150 guests turned to look at the man of the hour. Preston stepped up to the microphone stand that had been set up near the bottom of the grand staircase. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He was ready to deliver his tragic speech and have his wife hauled away in a straitjacket. He had absolutely no idea that I was completely sober, his mother was heavily drugged, and the entire house was entirely under my digital command. Preston cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone stand with hands that were shaking just slightly. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and Chicago elite, his face arranged into a flawless mask of manufactured sorrow. He bowed his head for a brief moment, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken husband to absolute perfection. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice thick with fake emotion, echoing through the grand living room. "This beautiful new home was supposed to be a fresh start for our family, but as many of you know, my wife has been struggling." A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Some of the guests cast pitying glances in my direction. I stood perfectly still in my emerald green gown, my posture rigid and unyielding. I maintained a serene, razor-sharp smile, waiting for him to dig his grave just a little bit deeper. "The trauma of the past year has been a heavy burden," Preston continued, placing a dramatic hand over his heart. "We have tried everything to bring Kelsey back to the vibrant woman she used to be. I have dedicated every waking hour to her care. But sometimes love is not enough to heal a fractured mind. Sometimes making the hardest choice is the only way to save the person you love." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the heavy silence stretch across the room. He was building up to the grand finale. He was about to announce that medical professionals were waiting outside to take me to a facility. He was about to publicly declare me insane so he could drain my corporate accounts on Monday morning. I slipped my hand into the pocket of my gown. My fingers wrapped around the cool metal of my secure burner phone. I unlocked the screen by touch my thumb hovering directly over the master execution icon I had programmed with Beatrice in the basement server room. I watched Preston take a deep, shaky breath, raising his head to look at the audience with tear-filled eyes. I pressed the button. Instantly, the crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed to a pitch black. The soft ambient lighting in the entire house was completely extinguished. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as they were plunged into sudden darkness. Then the massive 80-inch smart screen integrated seamlessly into the wall directly behind Preston flickered to life. The blinding glare of the display illuminated Preston's confused face. He tapped the microphone, assuming there had been a power surge or a technical malfunction. He had absolutely no idea that the house's central network had just been hijacked. The surround sound system, which had been gently playing classical music just moments ago, suddenly crackled with sharp, high-definition audio. The sound was deafening, bouncing off the high ceilings and echoing into every corner of the grand estate. Sylvia's harsh, unmistakable voice blasted through the hidden speakers. "Increase the dosage. She looks too coherent. If she does not sign that power of attorney, we cannot take over the auction house." The entire room of 150 high society guests froze. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every single eye snapped to the glowing 80-inch screen. The hidden camera footage from the library played in crystal clear 4K resolution. It was a perfectly framed, undeniably authentic video of Preston and Sylvia kneeling on the floor of my new home. The guests watched in absolute horror as Sylvia pulled up the hardwood floorboard and revealed the hidden safe. They watched her hold up the glass vial of mysterious white powder, aggressively complaining about how to properly lace my food to induce a psychotic breakdown. But the most damning moment was yet to come. On the massive screen, Preston let out a cruel, wicked laugh. His voice boomed across his own housewarming party, dripping with pure malice. "Do not worry, Mother," the digital. Preston said, his face magnified for all his wealthy investors to see. "I am calling the police next week to have her involuntarily committed. Everyone already thinks she is crazy anyway. Once she is locked in the psych ward, that $15 million company is mine. It will perfectly cover the losses from my other accounts." The video kept playing, showing them casually and gleefully plotting to forge my medical documents, drug my meals, and steal my entire life's work to cover up a massive financial fraud. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and visceral. The high society elite, the very people Preston had spent years trying to impress and swindle, gasped in absolute, unadulterated horror. Women covered their mouths with their hands. Men stared at the screen with expressions of sheer disgust and disbelief. The wealthy investors who had trusted Preston with their fortunes realized in a single horrifying second that the man standing at the podium was not a financial genius or a tragic husband. He was a ruthless, calculating criminal. Preston slowly turned around to look at the screen behind him. He saw his own face, larger than life, grinning as he plotted to drug his wife. He heard his own voice confessing to a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. The absolute reality of his destruction hit him like a freight train. There was no spinning this. There was no smooth talking his way out of a high-definition video confession broadcast to a room full of the most powerful people in Chicago. Preston's hand began to shake violently. The microphone slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a deafening, agonizing screech of audio feedback that made several guests cover their ears. Preston did not even flinch at the terrible noise. He just stood there, frozen at the podium. Every single drop of blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of white. He looked exactly like a ghost who had just realized he was dead. The deafening screech of audio feedback from the dropped microphone echoed through the grand living room, but nobody in the glittering crowd moved a single inch. 150 of Chicago's wealthiest elites stood paralyzed, staring back and forth between the massive 80-inch screen and the pale, sweating man standing at the podium. Preston looked exactly like a ghost who had just realized he was dead. For 5 agonizing seconds, total silence reigned. Then survival instinct kicked in. Preston snapped out of his frozen state. His eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on the faces of his most important investors, and he scrambled to salvage the burning wreckage of his life. He bent down, practically diving onto the hardwood floor to snatch up the discarded microphone. He fumbled with the power switch, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it a second time. When he finally got it working, his voice cracked loudly over the speakers. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He shouted that the video was a complete fabrication. He screamed that it was a deep fake, an elaborate AI-generated hallucination created by my shattered mind. He begged his wealthy clients to listen to him, insisting that my severe schizophrenia had pushed me to hire malicious hackers to frame him. He plastered a look of absolute frantic desperation on his face, playing the victim one last time. He yelled that this was exactly why he needed to have me committed to a psychiatric ward, claiming I was a danger to myself and his reputation. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, murmuring to one another. The lie was audacious, but Preston had spent over a year meticulously planting the seeds of my supposed insanity. Some of the older investors looked confused, their loyalty to their wealth manager briefly fighting against the horrifying, undeniable clarity of the 4K footage still looping behind him. I did not let him breathe another word. I stepped forward in my razor-sharp emerald gown. I did not run, and I did not shout. I walked with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator circling a wounded animal. The high society crowd immediately parted from me like the Red Sea shrinking back from the raw, undeniable power radiating from my posture. I was not a fragile, broken woman. I was a $15 million business owner, and I was about to execute a hostile takeover of my own life. I reached the podium. Preston instinctively stepped back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. I smoothly pulled the microphone right out of his sweaty, trembling grip. I turned to face the crowd. My voice was low, steady, and lethal. It carried through the grand estate with absolute authority. I told them there was no deepfake. I told them the footage they just watched was captured by a hidden security camera installed by the previous homeowner, a retired federal investigator who recognized a criminal the second she saw one. I challenged anyone in the room to walk right down the hall and pry up the third floorboard in the library. I told them they would find the hidden safe, the forged medical documents, and the exact vial of white powder Preston and his mother used to drug my meals. Preston opened his mouth to deny it, but I cut him off instantly. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke directly into the microphone. I called him exactly what he was: a fraud, a thief, a spineless coward who tried to poison his wife to steal her company because he was too incompetent to manage his own firm. Sylvia tried to shout from the back of the room, her voice slurring heavily from the drug she had ingested from the switched champagne glass. She stumbled forward trying to defend her son, but a pair of wealthy socialites physically stepped away from her in absolute disgust. I did not let up. I scanned the shocked crowd until my eyes landed on a tall, gaunt man in a tailored suit who was currently trying to discreetly edge his way toward the heavy mahogany front doors. I called out his name over the sound system, my voice ringing with icy precision. I addressed him as Mr. Mercer, making sure to emphasize the title. The crowd turned to follow my gaze, effectively trapping the man against the wall. I informed the entire room that Preston had brought this man into my home yesterday, introducing him as a top-tier psychiatric specialist. I announced that this man had attempted to diagnose me with severe schizophrenia and force me to sign away my legal rights. Then I dropped the hammer. I revealed that Mr. Mercer was not a doctor. I publicly announced that his medical license had been permanently revoked 3 years ago for illegally prescribing heavy narcotics. Mr. Mercer froze, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The guests around him physically recoiled, staring at him with pure revulsion. I did not stop there. I told the crowd exactly why a disgraced former doctor was willing to commit medical fraud. I revealed that Mercer owed Preston's collapsing investment firm over $2 million. He was a paid actor, a desperate pawn hired to help lock a sane woman in an asylum. The murmurs in the grand living room erupted into a cacophony of outrage. The wealthy investors were putting the pieces together. If their highly respected wealth manager was willing to hire fake doctors and drug his own wife to steal her private auction house, what else was he lying about? I turned my attention directly to the furious, panicked faces of Preston's most elite clients. I lowered my voice just a fraction, forcing them to hang on my every word. I told them Preston did not go through all this trouble just because he was greedy. He did it because he was completely, utterly bankrupt. I told the investors they needed to stop looking at me, and they needed to start looking at their own portfolios. At that exact second, a synchronized chilling sound echoed across the grand living room. Dozens of smartphones began chiming and vibrating simultaneously in the pockets and designer purses of the wealthy elite. Terrence had just hit send on the mass email. Men in expensive tuxedos and women in diamond necklaces frantically pulled out their phones. The bright screens illuminated their horrified faces. Terrence had sent them the heavily encrypted intercepted banking records. He had sent them the offshore account numbers, the dummy corporations, and the devastating undeniable proof of the massive Ponzi scheme. I watched the exact moment the realization hit them. I watched the blood drain from the faces of the most powerful people in Chicago. They saw the frantic wire transfers. They saw the empty balances. They realized the horrifying catastrophic truth. Their millions were gone. The grand living room erupted into absolute pandemonium. The momentary suffocating silence shattered the second the wealthy investors processed the financial documents glowing on their phone screens. The realization that their fortunes had been completely wiped out by the man standing at the podium transformed the high society crowd into an angry, ruthless mob. Crystal champagne glasses were slammed down onto marble tables. Men in expensive tuxedos began shouting, their faces turning violently red as they demanded answers. A prominent real estate developer lunged forward, grabbing Preston by the lapels of his custom suit and shaking him aggressively. Preston stumbled backward, crashing hard against the massive 80-inch smart screen that was still broadcasting the undeniable footage of his own criminal conspiracy. He held his hands up in a pathetic, trembling surrender, stammering out panicked excuses that no one was listening to. That was when Sylvia snapped. Seeing her golden child cornered and her entire world collapsing, she pushed her way through the furious crowd. She was operating on pure, desperate, aristocratic arrogance. She shoved herself between Preston and the angry investors, holding her arms out wide to shield him. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding that everyone step back and show some respect to her family. When the crowd did not back down, Sylvia turned her venomous gaze directly toward Terrence. Her face was contorted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered hatred. She pointed a shaking finger at him and began screaming the most vile, deeply offensive racial slurs imaginable. She told the entire room that Terrence was a low-class thug who had infiltrated their elite family just to destroy them. She shrieked that he fabricated the bank records because he was jealous of their wealth and status. She blamed his background, her voice cracking with pure bigotry, showing every single person in that room the true rotting core of her character. Then she whipped around to face me. She called me a pathological liar, a psychotic manipulating gold digger who had hired hackers to create a fake video. She took a step toward me, raising her hand as if she was going to strike me right across the face, but her hand never reached me. Mid-step, Sylvia suddenly froze. Her foot caught the edge of the expensive Persian rug, and she stumbled awkwardly, her arms flailing to catch her balance. She let out a sharp, confused gasp, clutching her chest. The powerful, specialized narcotics she had dumped into the champagne glass were finally kicking in. The drugs were originally intended for me. Preston and Sylvia had purchased them specifically because they induced symptoms that perfectly mimicked a severe, terrifying psychotic break. They were meant to cause intense hallucinations, extreme loss of physical coordination, and complete verbal diarrhea. And because Sylvia had swallowed the entire glass in one boastful gulp during her toast, she was receiving a massive, unadulterated dose. I stood perfectly still in my emerald gown, watching the exact moment her nervous system was completely hijacked. Sylvia's eyes widened in sheer, sudden terror. Her pupils dilated until they were almost entirely black. She looked around the grand living room, but she was no longer seeing the angry investors. She started batting frantically at the air in front of her face, screaming that there were bugs crawling out of the expensive floral arrangements. She clawed aggressively at her own neck, tearing off the heavy diamond necklace she was wearing and throwing it across the room as if it were burning her skin. The angry mob of investors immediately stopped shouting. They backed away from her in absolute shock and revulsion, creating a wide, empty circle around her in the center of the foyer. Sylvia lost her balance completely and crashed into a cocktail table, sending a tray of delicate appetizers clattering to the hardwood floor. She slumped against the base of the grand staircase, her expensive designer dress bunching up around her knees. The poised, untouchable matriarch of Chicago high society was reduced to a sweating, erratic mess in a matter of seconds. Then came the manic, unfiltered confession. The drug stripped away every single ounce of her self-control. She began to laugh. It was a loud, chilling, wildly inappropriate sound that echoed over the classical music still playing faintly in the background. She looked up at the ceiling and started rambling at the top of her lungs. She proudly bragged to the empty air about how brilliant her plan was. She laughed hysterically, shouting that the white powder was so incredibly easy to hide in the food. She slurred her words, boasting that she had paid the fake doctor in cash to make sure the psychiatric hold went smoothly. She pointed a shaking, uncoordinated finger at her son, who was watching her with an expression of pure, paralyzed horror. She yelled that Preston was a genius for stealing from his own sister to keep up appearances. She confessed everything loudly and proudly, completely unaware that she was testifying against herself in front of 150 witnesses. She practically sang about how they were going to liquidate my $15 million auction house by Monday morning and leave me rotting in a padded cell. The wealthy elite watched the spectacle with expressions of profound disgust. They pulled out their smartphones, recording the undeniable manic confession of the woman who had just spent the last hour pretending to be a tragic, caring mother-in-law. Preston dropped to his knees beside her, desperately trying to cover her mouth with his hand, begging her to stop talking. But she just bit his finger and laughed harder, shoving him away with surprising, frantic strength. Through the parted crowd of horrified socialites, Camille walked forward. Preston's sister moved with a slow, calculated, and absolute precision. She stopped right at the edge of the circle, looking down at her mother writhing and laughing on the floor, and her brother kneeling in the spilled champagne. There was no pity in Camille's eyes. There was only the cold, hard steel of a woman who had finally excised the poison from her life. Sylvia looked up, her vision swimming, and saw her daughter standing there. She let out a sloppy, drug-induced cheer, reaching a shaking hand out toward Camille, demanding that she help her up and tell these awful people to leave their beautiful house. Camille did not reach out her hand. She looked down at the woman who had insulted her marriage, stolen her children's future, and actively tried to destroy her sister-in-law. Camille's voice was completely devoid of emotion. It cut through the manic laughter like a razor blade. She informed her mother that she had just spent the entire afternoon sitting in the offices of the family's primary banking institution. She announced to the silent room that she had invoked an emergency severance clause in the family charter, utilizing the undeniable proof of Preston's financial crimes that Terrence had secured. Camille looked Sylvia dead in the eye. She stated with absolute, unwavering authority that she had legally severed all ties to the family estate. She announced that she had completely frozen Sylvia's personal trust fund and permanently blocked her access to every single shared account. Sylvia's manic laughter died in her throat. Even through the heavy haze of the narcotics, the reality of those words pierced her brain. Camille looked at her mother with pure, unfiltered disgust. She delivered the final devastating blow. "You have nothing left, Mom." Imagine unlocking the door to your dream home, a stunning $3 million estate, in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, only to discover it is a carefully constructed trap. 3 days after moving in, while I was unpacking the last of the kitchen boxes, my phone rang with an unknown number. It was the previous owner, a retired federal investigator named Beatrice. Her voice was dead serious. She told me she had forgotten to disconnect a hidden security camera in the study. She said she had just watched my husband and his mother pry up the hardwood floor, hide a bag of unidentified white powder in a secret safe, and discuss exactly which corrupt doctor they were going to pay to have me permanently committed to a psychiatric ward. She told me not to go home, to not tell my husband, and to meet her alone immediately. The phone nearly slipped from my sweating hands as the reality of her words crashed over me. "My name is Kelsey. I am 33 years old, and what my husband Preston did not know was that the fragile, easily manipulated wife he thought he was drugging was actually a high-end art restorer and the secret owner of a $15 million private auction house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who severely underestimated your intelligence. I left the house immediately and drove straight to the address Beatrice gave me. It was a quiet, dimly lit diner on the edge of town, far away from the manicured lawns of our neighborhood. Beatrice was sitting in a corner booth, her laptop already open on the Formica table. She did not offer any polite pleasantries. She just turned the screen toward me, tapped the spacebar, and told me to watch closely. The hidden camera footage was crystal clear. It showed Preston, the man I had loved and married 5 years ago, kneeling in my new library alongside his mother, Sylvia. Sylvia was a woman whose entire personality revolved around her fading old money status and her deep-seated belief that I was utterly beneath her family. In the video, she was holding a small vial of white powder. I heard her voice hiss through the laptop speakers, complaining that I was still too coherent and that they needed to drastically increase the dosage. She told Preston that without a formal medical certificate proving I had severe schizophrenia, they could never gain control of my lucrative art business. Preston just laughed. It was a cold, calculating, and cruel sound that I had never heard from him before. He assured his mother that he would call the police next week to have me involuntarily committed. He casually mentioned that everyone in our social circle already believed I was losing my mind. A narrative he had been carefully planting ever since my devastating miscarriage last year. He was weaponizing my deepest grief to steal my life. My blood ran ice cold, but the initial shock quickly morphed into a terrifying razor-sharp clarity. I was an art restorer. My entire career was built on spotting fakes, uncovering hidden layers, and meticulously repairing damage. I thanked Beatrice, memorized the exact location of the hidden floorboard safe from the video, and drove back to the house we had supposedly bought to start our fresh new life together. I pulled into the driveway, taking 2 deep breaths and forcing my hands to stop shaking before I turned the key in the front door. I had to play the role of the erratic, emotional wife perfectly. Preston was standing in the grand foyer waiting for me. He looked like the absolute picture of a devoted, loving husband. He wore a soft cashmere sweater, offering me his perfect practiced smile that I now knew was a complete mask. In one hand, he held a crystal glass of expensive red wine. In the other, he held 2 small capsules that he always insisted were my daily fertility vitamins. He walked toward me, his voice dripping with fake concern, asking how my afternoon errand was, and insisting I take my vitamins right away to help manage my stress levels. Every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run out the door, but I knew I had to play his game until I held all the winning cards. I reached for the wine glass, intentionally making sure my fingers trembled just enough to look clumsy and uncoordinated. As he handed the glass to me, I deliberately knocked the rim hard against his wrist. The dark red liquid splashed all over his expensive sweater and shattered across the pristine hardwood floor, looking almost like blood. Preston let out a sharp, aggressive breath. His charming mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the monster underneath, before he quickly caught himself and forced his smile back into place. I immediately started apologizing profusely, letting my voice pitch up in manufactured panic. I babbled frantically about being so clumsy and needing to get towels. Before he could stop me or force the pills into my hand, I bolted straight up the stairs and into the master bathroom, locking the heavy oak door firmly behind me. I turned the sink faucet on full blast to drown out any noise. Leaning against the cold marble counter, staring at my pale reflection, the terrifying reality set in. For months, I had believed the narrative they were feeding me. I thought my grief over losing my baby was making me lose my grip on reality. I thought the brain fog and exhaustion were my own fault. Now, knowing it was chemical, knowing it was deliberate, the sorrow evaporated. In its place, a cold and calculating rage took over. I was trapped in a house completely rigged by my enemies, married to a man actively trying to destroy my mind. But Preston had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He thought I was completely isolated. Reaching into the hidden lining of my leather tote bag, I pulled out a secure secondary phone I used solely for private art acquisitions. I quickly opened a new text message. I needed an ally, someone smart, ruthless, and entirely outside of Sylvia's sphere of influence. I typed the number for Terrence. Terrence was my brother-in-law, married to Preston's sister Camille. More importantly, he was a brilliant corporate attorney and an African-American man whom Sylvia absolutely despised. Her blatant racial prejudice and old money elitism meant she treated Terrence with constant, barely concealed disrespect, often making snide remarks about his background at family dinners. I knew Terrence saw right through the family's fake perfection. I typed my message with flying fingers. I need you at my house right now. Bring a professional bug sweeper. Do not tell your wife, and absolutely do not tell Preston. I hit send, gripping the edge of the sink as I waited for the battle to begin. The heavy mahogany front doors flew open with a deafening crash that shook the walls of the grand foyer. The bitter cold of the Chicago night rushed into the suffocating heat of the party, bringing with it a blinding flood of flashing red and blue emergency lights. Dozens of federal agents wearing tactical vests stamped with FBI and IRS poured into the room. Local police officers flanked them, moving with absolute military precision as they secured every single exit of the $3 million estate. The wealthy elite of the city scattered like frightened animals, pressing their backs against the expensive wallpaper to get out of the way. The lead federal agent marched straight through the center of the crowd. He completely ignored the gasping billionaires and the shattered crystal on the hardwood floor. He walked right past me, his eyes locked entirely on the sweating pale man standing near the digital fireplace. The agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. His voice boomed across the silent room with absolute authority. He looked Preston dead in the eye and told him he was under arrest for wire fraud, extortion, and attempted conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. Preston completely lost his mind. The arrogant, untouchable wealth manager evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, cornered coward. As two officers grabbed his arms to pull them behind his back, Preston violently jerked away. He thrashed against their grip, shouting that they had no right to touch him. He screamed that he was a highly respected financial advisor and that this was a massive, illegal misunderstanding. The officers did not hesitate. They shoved him hard against the edge of the grand staircase, forcing his arms back and locking the steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. Preston breathed heavily, his custom-tailored suit suddenly rumpled and stained with sweat. He looked wildly around the room for any sign of support. He looked at the powerful investors he had spent years kissing up to, but they all turned their heads away in pure disgust. He looked for his mother, but Sylvia was still rolling on the floor in the corner, laughing hysterically and hallucinating bugs crawling out of her designer dress. He looked for his sister, but Camille stood next to Terrence with a face carved from solid ice. He had absolutely no one left. No one except the woman he thought he had successfully broken. Preston locked his desperate, bloodshot eyes onto mine. I was standing just a few feet away in my radiant emerald gown, completely untouched by the chaos. His face shifted from blind rage to a pathetic manufactured panic. He desperately tried to play the role of the devoted husband one last time. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking as he strained against the officers holding him. He begged me to help him. He shouted that we were husband and wife, and that I promised to stand by him for better or for worse. He demanded that I immediately contact my bank and use the $15 million from my private auction house to post his bail. He ordered me to hire the most expensive defense team in the city to clear his name. He actually had the sheer audacity to look at the woman he had spent weeks poisoning and demand that she use her life savings to buy his freedom. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I stepped closer to him, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had just conquered her own personal hell. I looked down at him, my expression entirely devoid of mercy. My voice was icy sharp and carried clearly to every single person watching the spectacle. I told him I was not his wife. Preston froze, his mouth hanging open in confusion. I explained it to him very slowly so his panicked brain could process every single syllable. I told him my legal team had filed the official annulment papers 3 days ago. I detailed that the filing was based entirely on undeniable evidence of criminal fraud and premeditated physical endangerment. I told him our marriage was completely null and void. In the eyes of the law, we were absolute strangers. His eyes widened in sheer terror as the reality of his isolation finally crushed him. But I was not finished. I gestured casually to the massive, beautiful estate surrounding us. I told him to look closely at the house he thought he owned. I revealed that Beatrice, the retired federal investigator and the true owner of the property, had legally voided his lease to own contract yesterday afternoon. I explained that she terminated the agreement the exact second Terrence proved Preston had used stolen illicit funds from his Ponzi scheme to pay the initial deposit. I took one final step toward him, lowering my voice so he could hear the absolute finality of his defeat. I told him I had purchased the estate from Beatrice myself this morning using clean, legitimate money from the company he failed to steal. I smiled a lethal, victorious smile. I told him he was trespassing on my property and I wanted him off my floors. Preston let out a guttural sound of pure defeat, all the fight completely drained out of his body. His knees buckled and the police officers had to physically hold him up by his armpits. They dragged him forcefully toward the heavy mahogany doors. The high society crowd watched in absolute judging silence as the man who had robbed them blind was hauled out of the house in disgrace. At the exact same time, a team of genuine city, dispatched paramedics rushed through the doors with a medical gurney. They headed straight for Sylvia. The disgraced matriarch was still giggling wildly, completely lost in her narcotic haze. As the paramedics strapped her down to the gurney, she proudly shouted to the officers that she was a member of the elite upper class and demanded they serve her more champagne. It was the ultimate poetic degradation. The woman who had obsessed over her prestigious social standing her entire life was being wheeled out of a party, strapped down and raving like a lunatic in front of the most powerful people in the state. I stood in the center of my grand foyer and watched the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the pristine hardwood floors. I watched the police cruiser doors slam shut, locking Preston inside a cage he would likely never leave. I watched the ambulance doors secure Sylvia inside her own chemical nightmare. The heavy mahogany front doors remained wide open to the crisp, freezing Chicago night. The toxic, suffocating air that had filled my home for weeks was finally being pulled outside, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of total victory. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs completely. I had stepped into this house as a target, but tonight, I was the only one left standing. The silence in the grand estate was absolute. Just minutes ago, the foyer was filled with the frantic shouting of federal agents, the furious demands of ruined investors, and the pathetic, desperate pleas of a man who thought he could steal my life. Now the only sound was the heavy oak front doors clicking securely shut, sealing out the freezing Chicago night. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the stark red and blue lights of the police cruisers slowly fade down the long, winding driveway. They took Preston and Sylvia with them, stripping away their wealth, their freedom, and their carefully constructed illusions of grandeur. The 150 elite socialites had scattered like frightened animals the second the handcuffs came out, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic fallout. I stood alone in the center of the foyer, the silk fabric of my emerald gown brushing against the polished hardwood. The air in the house felt entirely different. The suffocating toxic weight that had pressed down on my chest for weeks was completely gone. I took a deep, unrestricted breath. Footsteps echoed from the private study. Terrence walked out, loosening his silk tie and unbuttoning the collar of his crisp corporate suit. Camille was right beside him. Her eyes were red from the emotional toll of watching her own mother and brother self-destruct, but her posture was straight, proud, and unbroken. Beatrice followed them, her sharp, calculating eyes scanning the empty room with deep satisfaction. The retired investigator had orchestrated the digital side of this war flawlessly, and she looked thoroughly pleased with the total devastation we had just unleashed. Terrence walked over to the surviving crystal bar cart in the corner of the living room. He bypassed the tainted champagne and reached for an untouched bottle of 20-year-old vintage scotch. He poured 4 generous glasses, handing them out in complete, reverent silence. We gathered in the grand living room, taking our seats on the plush velvet sofas that Sylvia had so aggressively curated just hours before. I raised my glass. The heavy crystal felt solid and real in my hand. We did not offer any grand speeches or dramatic toasts. We simply clinked our glasses together, the sharp chime ringing out like a victory bell. The scotch burned smoothly down my throat, washing away the lingering metallic taste of adrenaline and fear. Beatrice reached into her tailored blazer pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key ring. She placed it gently on the glass coffee table, pushing it toward me. She stated clearly that the house was now officially and legally mine, completely free from the tainted lease agreement Preston had tried to use. The physical transfer of the keys felt like the final lock clicking into place. The fortress was secure. As I set my glass down, Terrence's phone vibrated sharply in his suit pocket. The sudden noise made us all tense for a fraction of a second, a residual reflex from the intense psychological warfare we had just endured. Terrence pulled out the device, his dark eyes scanning the glowing screen. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. He looked at his wife, reaching out to gently grasp her hand. He announced that his contacts at the federal building had just confirmed the initial asset seizure. The IRS and the FBI had simultaneously locked down every single one of Preston's hidden offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and illicit shell companies. The financial blockade was absolute and impenetrable. Terrence explained the legal mechanisms clearly. Because he had provided the authorities with the exact, unalterable paper trail prior to the raid, the federal insurance protocols were already in active motion. The millions of dollars Preston had ruthlessly drained from his own family were fully accounted for. The college trust funds for Terrence and Camille's children would be completely restituted by the end of the fiscal quarter. Camille let out a breath she looked like she had been holding for days. She leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, a profound look of relief washing over her exhausted features. She had lost her biological family tonight, but looking at Terrence, it was fiercely clear she had chosen the family that actually mattered. The future of their children, the future Preston had tried to steal out of pure greed, was entirely secure. I leaned back against the plush velvet cushions, letting the warmth of the scotch and the reality of our absolute victory settle into my bones. For a year, I had allowed grief to turn me into a ghost. I had allowed my husband to convince me that my mind was broken, that my sorrow over my miscarriage was a symptom of insanity. He had used my vulnerability as a weapon to orchestrate his massive financial crimes. But sitting in the quiet luxury of the house I now truly owned, surrounded by the 3 people who had risked everything to help me execute this flawless takedown, I realized a profound truth. I did not survive the darkest chapter of my life by shrinking away or hiding from the pain. I survived by embracing the cold, calculating clarity of pure rage. I had taken the very intelligence and precision that made me a world-class art restorer, and I had sharpened my mind into an unstoppable weapon. 6 months passed since the flashing red and blue lights faded down my long driveway. The winter frost had melted away, replaced by the warm, vibrant colors of a Chicago spring. The changing seasons perfectly mirrored the absolute transformation of my own life. The justice system moves slowly, but when it finally drops the hammer on white-collar criminals, the impact is utterly devastating. Preston stood before a federal judge just 2 weeks ago. I sat in the front row of the courtroom wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit and watched the man who tried to destroy my mind face the absolute ruin of his own. The federal prosecutors did not hold back a single piece of evidence. They presented the offshore bank accounts, the forged medical documents, and the desperate, pathetic wire transfers. The judge looked at Preston with pure, unfiltered disgust. He called Preston a predator who had abused his fiduciary duty and weaponized the legal system against his own wife and family. The gavel came down with a heavy final crack. Preston was sentenced to a mandatory 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The arrogant, untouchable wealth manager was stripped of his custom Italian suits and his country club memberships. He was escorted out of the courtroom in a standard issue orange jumpsuit, his hands and ankles bound by heavy steel chains. He did not look back at me. He had nothing left to say. Sylvia received a punishment that was perhaps even more poetic than a prison sentence. Because Camille had legally severed all ties and frozen the family trust, Sylvia was left completely destitute. The high society friends she had spent decades trying to impress dropped her immediately. No one wanted to be associated with the mother of a convicted fraudster. Sylvia was evicted from her luxury condominium. The woman who had constantly mocked others for their background now lives in a dilapidated, low-income studio apartment on the harsh industrial outskirts of the city. I heard through the legal grapevine that her new apartment has peeling wallpaper, a constantly leaking sink, and a view of a brick alleyway. She has no servants to boss around, no vintage champagne to drink, and no power over anyone. She is entirely alone, rotting away in the exact kind of low-class environment she had spent her entire life fiercely looking down upon. With the toxic poison of my former in-laws completely eradicated, my own life flourished in ways I had only ever dreamed of. Freed from the suffocating gaslighting and the constant draining psychological warfare, my mind was sharper than ever. I poured all my energy into my private auction house. The high society elite who had witnessed my unmasking of Preston at the gala realized I was a woman of absolute integrity and unparalleled expertise. My client list exploded. I secured exclusive appraisal contracts with 3 national museums. In just 6 months, the value of my company skyrocketed from $15 million to well over $30 million. I also took back absolute control of my physical space. I hired a massive contracting crew and completely gutted the $3 million estate. I had them rip out the hardwood floorboards in the library where Sylvia and Preston had hidden their drugs. I threw away every single piece of pretentious heavy velvet furniture Sylvia had chosen. I painted the walls in bright, breathable colors and filled the rooms with mid-century modern pieces and breathtaking art that I personally curated. The house was no longer a rigged cage. It was a beautiful, sprawling sanctuary of my own design. This morning, the air was crisp and bright. I stepped out onto my expansive second-floor balcony, leaning my hands against the cool glass railing. I looked out over the sprawling green lawn of my estate, watching the distant Chicago skyline gleam under the clear blue sky. Down below in the backyard, the sounds of genuine, unfiltered joy floated up on the morning breeze. Terrence was standing in front of a massive stainless steel grill, expertly flipping burgers and laughing loudly. He looked completely relaxed, dressed in a casual t-shirt and jeans, a far cry from the rigid corporate armor he wore to navigate Sylvia's prejudice. Camille was setting the large wooden patio table with fresh salads and cold drinks. She was glowing, her face free from the heavy burden of her toxic biological family. Their 2 beautiful children were running through the lush green grass, chasing a bright red soccer ball and squealing with absolute delight. They were a strong, thriving African-American family, and they had brought genuine warmth and love back into my home. I smiled, feeling a profound, radiant warmth blooming in my chest. I lifted my ceramic mug and took a long sip of my hot black coffee. I closed my eyes and took a deep, unrestricted breath of the fresh spring air. I felt completely grounded, completely safe, and completely alive. I turned around and walked back inside, making my way through the sunlit hallway and into my private study. I walked over to the heavy oak desk and looked up at the small, inconspicuous air vent near the ceiling. It was the exact spot where Beatrice had hidden the security camera all those months ago. It was the mechanical eye that had captured the horrifying truth and given me the weapon I needed to save my own life. I pulled a small wooden step stool over to the wall. I climbed up, reaching my fingers through the metal grates of the vent. I felt the small, hard plastic of the recording device. I did not need it to protect me anymore. My enemies were gone, and my fortress was impenetrable. I grasped the small wire connected to the camera. I smiled a bright, victorious smile, and I pulled the plug, disconnecting it for good. Total freedom. Total victory. The greatest lesson is that true power does not come from waiting for rescue. It comes from transforming vulnerability into an impenetrable weapon. When people entrusted with your care manipulate your deepest grief to orchestrate your downfall, silence is not surrender, it is strategy. Enduring their cruelty taught me that a sharp mind fueled by precise calculation will always dismantle any deceitful empire. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a woman who realizes she is her own ultimate savior. If you have ever reclaimed your power from toxic manipulators, hit subscribe and share your own victory in the comments below.